Facebook Emotional Contagion Study. Facebook secretly manipulated the emotions of nearly 700,000 users to see if they could make people depressed. And it worked. This happened in 2012. The year was 2012, and researchers at Facebook's headquarters in Menlo Park, California, were conducting an experiment that would become one of the most controversial studies in the history of social media. Adam Kramer, a Facebook data scientist, teamed up with Jeffrey Hancock, a professor at Cornell University, and Jamie Guillory from the University of California, San Francisco. Together, they had access to something no psychologist in history had ever possessed: the ability to manipulate the emotions of hundreds of thousands of people simultaneously. Over the course of 1 week in January, from the 11th to the 18th, the researchers randomly selected 689,003 Facebook users. These people had no idea they were participants in a psychology experiment. They were just scrolling through their feeds, checking on friends, looking at photos. But the algorithm had been changed. For some users, Facebook suppressed posts containing positive emotional words. For others, the platform reduced posts with negative content. The users saw fewer posts from their friends than normal, and they had no idea why. The researchers then analyzed what these users posted afterward. They counted positive versus negative words using specialized software. The results were exactly what the researchers hoped for. Users who saw more negative content subsequently posted more negative words themselves. Those exposed to more positive content posted more positively. Emotional states could be transferred through a social network. Facebook had successfully manipulated the moods of nearly 700,000 people. The study was conducted in January 2012, but it wasn't published until June 2014. For over 2 years, Facebook and Cornell kept this experiment hidden. When the paper finally appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, the public reaction was immediate and furious. People felt betrayed. They'd been turned into lab rats without their knowledge or consent. Adam Kramer posted an apology on Facebook on June 29, 2014. He wrote that in hindsight, the research benefits may not have justified all of this anxiety, but he wasn't fired. He wasn't demoted. Jeffrey Hancock at Cornell was required to take additional ethics training. That was it. Facebook updated its data use policy in July 2014 and claimed to strengthen its internal oversight. No fines were issued. No legal penalties were imposed. Here's the disturbing part. The researchers obtained approval from Cornell's Ethics Review Board in June 2012, 6 months after they'd already collected all the data. And the irony? Facebook wanted to see if negativity was contagious, so they intentionally exposed hundreds of thousands of users to more negativity to test it. They made people feel worse to prove they could make people feel worse. Das, David Reimer. The John Joan case. A doctor convinced parents to raise their son as a daughter after a medical accident, then lied about the results while the child suffered for decades. It ended in self-deletion. Bruce Reimer was born on August 22, 1965, in Winnipeg, Canada, along with his identical twin brother, Brian. When the boys were 8 months old, they underwent a routine circumcision, but Bruce's procedure went horribly wrong. The doctor used cauterization, and it destroyed Bruce's penis. The parents were devastated and desperate for answers. Then, they saw Dr. John Money on television. Money was a psychologist and sexologist at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, one of the leading experts on gender identity in the world. He had a theory: gender is purely learned, not biological, and Bruce Reimer was the perfect test case. He had an identical twin brother who could serve as a built-in control group. At 22 months old, Bruce underwent surgical castration. His testicles were removed. His parents renamed him Brenda and were told to raise him as a girl, telling no one the truth. Every year, Brenda was brought to Johns Hopkins for follow-up visits with Dr. Money. What happened during those sessions was disturbing. David Reimer later confirmed that Money forced him and his twin brother Brian to inspect each other's genitals. Money showed the children pornographic images. He forced them into what he called sexual rehearsal play positions. David described the sessions as cult-like and traumatic, but Brenda never felt like a girl. She tore off dresses. She preferred boys' toys. She was bullied at school. By age 13, she threatened self-deletion if forced to see money again. At age 15, her father finally told her the truth. Immediately, Brenda began living as a male and changed her name to David. Meanwhile, Dr. Money was publishing papers claiming complete success. From 1972 to 1997, he told the medical world that Brenda was well-adjusted, feminine, and happy. He used this case to support gender reassignment for intersex infants. It was all a lie. David's adult life was marked by struggle. He married and worked as a janitor, but depression followed him. His twin brother Brian developed schizophrenia and died by self-deletion on July 1st, 2002. 2 years later, after separating from his wife and losing his job, David died by self-deletion on May 4th, 2004. He was 38 years old. In 1997, psychiatrist Milton Diamond tracked David down and exposed the truth. David went public in 2000 with the book As Nature Made Him. Dr. Money never apologized. He faced no sanctions, never lost his medical license, and continued working at Johns Hopkins until retirement. He died in 2006 with his reputation damaged, but never prosecuted. The Third Wave Experiment. A history teacher accidentally created a fascist movement in his high school. In just 5 days, students were ready to hurt non-believers. Over 200 students joined. The year was 1967, and Ron Jones was a 25-year-old first-year history teacher at Cubberley High School in Palo Alto, California. During a lesson on World War II, a student asked a question that Jones couldn't answer satisfactorily. How could German people claim they didn't know about the Holocaust? So Jones decided to show them instead of tell them. On Monday, April 3rd, Jones introduced his second-period class to a concept he called strength through discipline. He taught the students strict discipline techniques, how to sit with perfect posture, feet flat, hands clasped behind their backs. Students had to stand beside their desks to answer questions, and answers had to be 3 words, or less, delivered crisply. The class of approximately 30 students embraced the structure enthusiastically. On day 2, Jones introduced strength through community. He created a salute, a cupped hand raised to the shoulder resembling a wave. He named the movement the Third Wave. Students began saluting each other in the hallways. Jones created membership cards and distributed them throughout the school. The movement began spreading beyond the original class. By day 3, Jones issued membership cards to over 200 students. Some cards were marked with a red X, designating secret informants who were told to report members not following the rules. Students were recruiting their friends aggressively. Some proposed making the Third Wave a nationwide movement. Parents began calling the school with concerns. Jones realized the experiment was spiraling out of control. On day 4, students were acting as bodyguards for Jones. 3 students were assigned to guard the classroom and prevent non-members from entering. Athletes who refused to join were bullied. Students were reporting on their friends and family. The movement had taken on cult-like characteristics. Jones later admitted he was frightened by how far it had gone. On Friday, April 7th, Jones told the students that the Third Wave was part of a nationwide youth movement and that they would be addressed by a national leader on television at noon. Over 200 students packed into the auditorium. The crowd exhibited rally-like behavior, chanting and saluting. Jones showed them a blank television screen, then footage of Nazi rallies. He projected images of the Holocaust and told them, "You have been used, manipulated. You are no better than the Germans you criticized." Students broke down crying. Some went into denial, refusing to believe they'd been fooled. Many reported feeling betrayed by their trusted teacher. Friendships were damaged between members and those who had refused to join. Students who had informed on others faced lasting consequences within the school community. Ron Jones faced no disciplinary action. He continued teaching at Cubberley for several years and later taught at San Francisco juvenile detention facilities. He expressed remorse in later writings, but also maintained that it was a valuable lesson. There was no formal follow-up of the students' psychological states. The Tea Room Trade Study. A sociologist destroyed men's lives by secretly documenting their bathroom activities, then showed up at their homes in disguise a year later. This was during the Lavender Scare. Homosexuality was criminal. The year was 1965, and Laud Humphreys was a PhD candidate in sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. He was also a former Episcopal priest, married with children. What nobody knew at the time was that Humphreys himself was a closeted gay man. He wanted to study homosexual behavior in an era when it could destroy your entire life. Humphreys began frequenting public restrooms in Forest Park and other St. Louis parks, places known as tea rooms, where men met for anonymous sexual encounters. But he wasn't there as a participant. He posed as a watch queen, a lookout who watches for police. The men thought he was part of their community, maybe a voyeur. They had no idea he was a researcher taking detailed notes. As he stood watch, Humphreys secretly recorded their license plate numbers. Then came Phase 2. Humphreys lied to the Department of Motor Vehicles, claiming to be conducting market research. He obtained the names and addresses of 50 men from their vehicle registrations. He cross-referenced this information with city directories to determine their marital status, occupation, and neighborhood. 54% of them were married. A year later, Humphreys changed his appearance. Different haircut, different clothes. He showed up at these men's homes unannounced, claiming to be conducting a health survey. He interviewed them in front of their wives and families, asking detailed personal questions about health, marital satisfaction, and lifestyle. The men didn't recognize him from the restrooms. The risk these men faced was extreme. In Missouri, sodomy laws made homosexual behavior criminal. If their identities were leaked, they could face arrest, job loss, and family destruction. The social stigma in the 1960s was devastating. Some of these men had children. Many were respected professionals in their communities. Humphreys defended his dissertation in 1968. Some faculty members were deeply troubled, but the committee passed him. In 1970, he published the research as a book titled Tea Room Trade: Impersonal Sex in Public Places. The academic reaction was immediate controversy. Sociologists like Alvin Goldner and Irving Louis Horowitz condemned it as a massive invasion of privacy. Humphreys was initially hired by Southern Illinois University in 1968, but was fired in 1970 amid the controversy. He was hired by SUNY Albany in 1972. He received death threats from homophobic groups and criticism from gay rights advocates for exposing the community. He later came out as gay himself and contracted AIDS. He died in 1988. Laud Humphreys was never formally sanctioned by any professional organization. The American Sociological Association revised its code of ethics in 1971, directly influenced by the Tea Room Trade Study. The monster study, researchers deliberately destroyed children's ability to speak to prove a theory about stuttering, then hid it for 60 years. The victims were orphan children with no parental protection. The year was 1939, and Wendell Johnson was a graduate student at the University of Iowa. Johnson himself had suffered from a severe stutter since childhood, and he wanted to prove that stuttering was a learned behavior, not something you were born with. To test his theory, he needed subjects who couldn't say no. So he turned to the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport. 22 orphan children, ranging from age 5 to 15, were selected for the study. Johnson's graduate student assistant, Mary Tudor, divided them into groups. 6 children who already stuttered received positive therapy, told their speech was fine. Another 6 who stuttered received negative therapy, criticized for every imperfection. 5 normal-speaking children received positive reinforcement. But the real target group was the final 5, normal-speaking children who would receive negative therapy. From January to May of 1939, Mary Tudor visited the orphanage regularly. She told these 5 normal-speaking children that they were beginning to stutter. She criticized their speech constantly, calling it very poor. She told them to stop talking unless they could do it correctly. Every speech imperfection was pointed out. She labeled them as stutterers over and over again, making them intensely self-conscious about every word they spoke. The effects were immediate. The children became withdrawn and anxious. They stopped speaking freely. Some developed speech problems that hadn't existed before. One victim, Hazel Potter Dornbush, struggled with speech issues her entire life. The children had been given a complex about their speech that many never overcame. When Mary Tudor completed her master's thesis documenting these results, Wendell Johnson reviewed the findings and recognized the ethical problems. His response was to bury the research. He never published the findings, fearing comparison to Nazi human experiments. The files were stored in University of Iowa archives and forgotten. Johnson went on to become a prominent professor at the University of Iowa, publishing extensively on stuttering without ever mentioning this study. He developed what he called the diagnosogenic theory, which ironically proposed that being diagnosed as a stutterer could cause stuttering. He died in 1965, never held accountable. The study remained hidden for 62 years. In 2001, San Jose Mercury News reporter Jim Dyer discovered it in the archives and published an expose on June 11th. The story generated immediate national attention and outrage. Surviving subjects were contacted and interviewed. In August 2001, the University of Iowa issued a formal apology to the survivors and their families. In 2007, the university paid a settlement of $925,000 divided among 6 survivors, including Mary Tudor Jacobs, Hazel Potter Dornbush, Clarence Pfeiffer, and the estates of 3 deceased subjects. Mary Tudor, the graduate student who conducted the experiments, lived with guilt her entire life and died in 2013 at age 101. Pit of Despair, Harry Harlow. A psychologist built a literal torture chamber for babies to prove that love matters. He called it the Pit of Despair. It was designed to induce depression. The year was 1960, and Harry Harlow was a professor of psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was also the president of the American Psychological Association and one of the most respected primatologists in the world. His earlier work with cloth mothers versus wire mothers had shown that baby monkeys preferred soft, comforting contact over food. It was groundbreaking research that proved attachment wasn't just about nutrition, but Harlow's personal life was falling apart. His first wife died of cancer in 1970. He remarried, but he was suffering from severe depression and alcoholism. And during this time, his experiments took a dark turn. Harlow built a device he called the Pit of Despair. He also referred to it as the Well of Loneliness and his tunnel to hell. It was a vertical steel chamber, approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, with sloped sides that prevented climbing. The chamber was designed to create total social isolation and induce psychopathology in monkeys. Infant rhesus monkeys, some as young as 3 months old, were placed inside. They were kept in near total darkness with minimal sensory stimulation. Some were isolated for 30 days, others for 6 months, some for an entire year. Food and water were accessible, but there was zero interaction with other monkeys or humans. The effects were devastating. During isolation, the baby monkeys would huddle in the corner for days. They clutched themselves, rocking back and forth repetitively. Some began biting their own flesh, engaging in severe self-mutilation that increased with the duration of isolation. When they were finally released, the monkeys that had been isolated for 30 days were disturbed, but showed some capacity for recovery. Those isolated for 6 months suffered severe psychological damage with limited ability to recover. The monkeys isolated for 12 months were completely psychologically destroyed. They would never recover. These monkeys stared blankly for hours. They rocked continuously. They refused to eat unless force-fed initially. They showed no sexual behavior as adults. Female monkeys who later became mothers were abusive or completely neglectful, unable to care for their offspring. Harlow himself acknowledged that the monkeys were obliterated psychologically. Many of the monkeys were euthanized after the experiments concluded. Those kept alive remained permanently damaged, unable to socialize or function normally for the rest of their lives. Harry Harlow received the National Medal of Science in 1967. He faced no sanctions from the university and continued his research until retirement in 1974. He died in 1981, largely unrepentant about his methods. His work is simultaneously cited for proving the importance of maternal bonds and condemned for the horrific methods used to demonstrate it. Electroshock therapy on children, Loretta Bender. A pioneering child psychiatrist gave toddlers electroshock therapy without anesthesia because she thought their brains were still developing. Children as young as 3 years old were strapped down and shocked repeatedly. The year was 1942, and Dr. Loretta Bender was the senior psychiatrist and director of the Children's Psychiatric Ward at Bellevue Hospital in New York City. She was a pioneer in child psychiatry who had developed the Bender Gestalt test, a diagnostic tool still used today. She was highly respected in her field and published extensively in medical journals. Bender believed that a condition she called childhood schizophrenia could be treated with electroconvulsive therapy. She thought that early intervention with ECT could prevent adult mental illness. The problem was that childhood schizophrenia was an overly broad diagnosis. Many of the children she treated likely had autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, learning disabilities, or simple behavioral problems. Some may have been completely normal children with minor adjustment issues. Over the course of the 1940s and 1950s, Bender treated over 100 children with electroshock therapy. Many were as young as 3 years old. These were often institutionalized children from poor families with limited parental oversight. The treatments were conducted without anesthesia and without muscle relaxants, neither of which were available in the early years of her practice. The procedure was brutal. Children were brought to the treatment room and placed on a table. Electrodes were attached to their temples. The children were too young to understand what was happening. When the electric current was applied, they immediately lost consciousness. Their entire bodies convulsed in full grand mal seizures. The muscle spasms were so severe that children risked biting their tongues, suffering compression fractures in their bones, or dislocating their joints. Some children received 20 to 30 treatments over the course of weeks. Others reportedly received over 100 treatments over extended periods. After each treatment, the children experienced confusion, disorientation, memory loss, headaches, and extreme fatigue. One of the most documented survivors was Ted Chabasinski. He was made a ward of the state after his mother was institutionalized for mental illness. At age 6 in 1943, he was sent to Bellevue and diagnosed with childhood schizophrenia. He received multiple ECT treatments. The experience left him with permanent memory loss from his childhood and lasting trauma. He later described the treatments as torture. Chabasinski eventually overcame his trauma and became a lawyer. In the 1970s, he began activism against ECT and helped pass legislation in California restricting its use. He organized other psychiatric survivors and testified before legislatures. He died in 2020 at age 83. Dr. Loretta Bender faced no sanctions during her career. She continued publishing and practicing, eventually moving to Creedmoor Psychiatric Center after Bellevue. She retired with her reputation intact within the psychiatric community and died in 1987 at age 90. She never apologized or recanted her methods. The Robbers Cave Experiment. Researchers turned a summer camp into Lord of the Flies on purpose. Within days, 11-year-old boys were burning each other's flags and raiding cabins. Parents thought their kids were at a normal camp. The year was 1954, and Muzaffar Sharif was a professor of psychology at the University of Oklahoma. He was an expert in social psychology and group dynamics, and he wanted to understand how prejudice and conflict develop between groups. This was his third attempt at this experiment. The first in 1949 failed when the boys discovered the deception. The second in 1953 was abandoned because the hostility became too extreme. For the final attempt, Sharif chose Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma, a remote 200-acre wilderness area. 22 boys, all 11 or 12 years old, were recruited from the Oklahoma City area. They were white, Protestant, middle-class children with no prior behavioral problems. Their parents signed standard camp consent forms, believing their sons were attending a normal Boy Scout-type summer camp. The parents had no idea it was a psychology experiment. The researchers posed as camp counselors. The boys were divided into two groups of 11 and kept completely separate for the first week. Neither group knew the other existed. During this bonding phase, the groups hiked, swam, and camped together. They developed strong group identities. One group named themselves the Rattlers. The other called themselves the Eagles. They created flags and established hierarchies within their groups. In week 2, the researchers introduced the groups to each other and announced a competitive tournament. There would be baseball games, tug-of-war contests, cabin inspections, and treasure hunts. The winning team would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. The conflict escalated rapidly. It started with name-calling and taunts. Then the Rattlers burned the Eagles' flag. The Eagles retaliated by raiding the Rattlers' cabin, overturning beds, and scattering belongings. Personal items were stolen. The boys engaged in physical altercations, pushing and shoving that escalated to punches being thrown. The researchers had to physically separate them. Food fights were deliberately started in the mess hall. The groups demanded to eat separately because they couldn't stand being near each other. By the 4th day of conflict, the researchers realized the situation was getting out of hand. Boys were forming genuine hatred for members of the other group. Some became distressed and wanted to go home. In week 3, Sharif attempted to resolve the conflict. Simply bringing the groups together for pleasant activities didn't work. Fights broke out immediately. So the researchers created what they called superordinate goals, problems that required both groups to cooperate. They staged a water shortage, and the boys had to work together to find and fix the break in the water line. They staged a truck breakdown that required both groups to pull it together. By pooling money from both groups, they could afford to rent a movie. Gradually, the hostility decreased. Cross-group friendships began to form. By the end of the 3 weeks, the groups voluntarily sat together and chose to ride home on the same bus. Muzaffar Sharif faced no consequences. He went on to have a distinguished career in social psychology and died in 1988. The experiment became a classic study taught in every social psychology course, though it's now also used as an example of what not to do ethically. Zoals Duitsers en Duits.